About 5 years ago, when I was 16, I lived in a rural area in western Pennsylvania. My family's house was far from the city, surrounded by forests and quiet roads. At night, the silence was almost total, only interrupted by the wind swaying, the trees, or the distant howl of a coyote. I was used to this tranquility, but that night something terrifying happened. My mom had gone out and wouldn't be back until early morning. I was home alone with my younger brother. While I was preparing dinner in the kitchen, I heard a strange sound coming from the porch. It didn't sound like someone knocking on the door normally, but more like spaced out, firm taps, as if someone was testing the structure of the house or trying to get our attention in a strange way. I paused for a moment and looked at the door, but all I saw was the reflection of the house's light on the glass. Since the sound didn't repeat, I figured it was a branch or some animal and went back to cooking. A little while later, the sound returned, but this time it came from the window. It was loud enough to make me stop everything and immediately look toward the living room. My heart raced. I called my brother, thinking he might be playing a prank on me, but there was no response. I walked slowly to the window and tried to see outside, but all I saw was darkness. Still, I had a bad feeling, like someone was out there standing, watching me. Suddenly, we heard footsteps on the porch. At that moment, my brother came running down the stairs. "Did you hear that out back too?" he asked, terrified. I motioned for him to be quiet, and we stood there listening intently. Seconds later, we heard the footsteps again outside. In my head, I ran through several possibilities. Could it be a neighbor? Someone lost? But why would this person tap on the windows instead of ringing the doorbell or calling our names? I asked out loud if anyone was out there, but no one answered. My brother suggested it might be a distraction, trying to get us to look in one direction while something was happening in the back of the house. That made me even more alert. I went to the cupboard, grabbed a 9mm and loaded it. "I'll scare him off," I whispered to my brother, who seemed uncertain about the idea. Before heading out, we locked the front door. When my brother turned, on the outside lights I saw a man standing on the porch. He was thin, with very pale skin, and wore a sweatshirt that was too big for his frame. His eyes were a very light blue, almost translucent. As soon as he saw me, he froze. For a moment, I felt like I was staring at something that shouldn't be there. But then he turned and ran toward the forest. Instinctively, I ran a few meters after him and fired a shot into the air just to scare him. "Bastard!" I yelled. But he didn't stop or look back. That's when a chill ran down my spine. When I turned to face the house, I froze. There were several people around the porch and near the windows, standing, staring at me. Further back, near the trees, other figures were also watching. They were men and women, all dressed in dark clothing. None of them said a word. They just stood there, staring at me, as if they were disappointed. Suddenly, without making a sound, they all started moving. They ran in different directions and disappeared into the forest. I stood there, frozen, not knowing what to do. When I finally snapped out of it, I ran inside and locked the door. My brother, panicked, called the police. The officers arrived quickly and searched the property. They found footprints, but nothing else. They seemed skeptical of our story and asked several times if we had been hosting a party or if those people had threatened us. What still scares me to this day is that if they were just intruders or pranksters, they would have said something or reacted to the shot. But no, they just stood there staring, as if I had interrupted something I wasn't supposed to understand. My brother thinks it was some kind of cult. I prefer to think they were criminals who backed off when they saw the gun. But what has never left my mind is, why didn't they say anything? We never saw them in town again. After that night, we got a dog. When I was in high school, one day my brother, 2 cousins, and I decided to go on an adventure through the woods behind our house. We had explored those trails when we were younger, but this time we wanted to go further and experience something memorable. We packed flashlights, food, backpacks, and everything we thought we'd need. We knew the trip might be long and we could have to camp out. Being the oldest and the most responsible, I took the compass to guide us, trusting my skills. It was an impulsive decision, as we were all under 17 and our confidence made us forget about the risks. Our parents were suspicious but didn't try to stop us. I was the one carrying the compass and most of the supplies, like the tents and water, because of my size. My brother Joe took the first aid kit and the flashlights, while my cousins Lily and Tom split the food. For safety, Lily brought a flare gun, though we hoped we wouldn't need to use it. The hike went smoothly for the most part, until after a few hours we spotted a wooden structure in the middle of the vegetation. We didn't know what it was, but our curiosity drove us closer. By the time we got there, the sun was setting, and we saw it was a fire lookout tower, probably abandoned. The tower seemed to be around 60 to 70 feet tall, but we quickly realized that climbing it would be risky. The ladder was old, with no visible support beams, and it looked dangerous. We left our backpacks on the ground and discussed whether we should climb. Lily and I wanted to go up, thinking about the view from the top, but Joe and Tom were afraid. The ladder wouldn't hold our weight. Still, with some courage, we started climbing, carefully placing our feet. Halfway up, a rotten step broke under my weight and my leg got stuck in the wood. I lost my balance, fell, and twisted my ankle. I screamed in pain as I tried to free my leg and sat on the step. My cousins and my brother rushed to help. Lily, terrified, decided to climb back down to the ground. When Joe and Tom reached me, I told them I was okay, but that we needed to leave right away. Joe went down first but stopped and pointed at a tree, saying, "Did you see that?" We all looked and saw a figure standing, watching us. It was partially hidden behind a tree. We couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, but they looked very thin, with gray hair and worn clothes like they had stepped out of an old trunk of clothes. Fear overtook us. The person didn't move, just stared at us in silence. Suddenly, they began walking toward us, heading toward the tower's ladder. Panicked, we raced to the top. When I was almost at the top, I looked down and saw the person rummaging through our backpacks. I yelled, "Take whatever you want and go," as my friends tried to open the hatch at the top of the tower. The person looked at me and shouted something I couldn't understand. Their voice was strange and seemed to be a woman's. I grabbed a small pocket knife and stood on the tower's platform, waiting for the person to climb after us. To our surprise, they didn't. Instead, they sat at the base of the ladder and began eating what they had taken from our backpacks. As night fell, the situation became even more terrifying. The darkness of the forest surrounded us and the hatch wouldn't open, making it impossible to descend safely. You might be wondering, why didn't you just go down and confront the person? That idea crossed my mind several times, but I was hurt and we didn't have flashlights. We didn't know if the person was armed and the flare gun wouldn't have helped. Even if we had used it, we couldn't defend ourselves with the platform above our heads. When the sun finally came up, my body was exhausted and aching. Joe, Tom, and Lily had stayed awake all night, silently fearful of what might happen. When we looked down, we saw the person was gone. Slowly, I made my way down to the base of the tower, and with Joe and Tom's help, we gathered what was left of our things. The next 14 hours were the longest of my life, until we finally got home, and I collapsed on the couch, relieved and drained. To this day, I don't know who that person was. Maybe they were someone living alone in the woods. We also never figured out why the hatch wouldn't open. Tom suggested someone might have locked it from the outside, but that seemed impossible. What's strangest is that, despite all the fear, we came home only tired and shaken, with the exception of my injured leg, which in a way saved us. If we had camped on the ground, that person might have approached while we slept. What could have happened? I'd rather not think about it. That experience has never left my mind. Whenever someone asks about the scariest moment of my life, I tell them this story. In 2008, when I started high school, it wasn't one of the best times of my life. In fact, I had a huge disdain for politics and how the school operated. The school environment simply didn't mesh with me. Most of the students and teachers seemed to come from completely different worlds, and I felt more and more isolated. I decided that I would finish high school, but I thought that place was toxic and a waste of time. Of course, this perspective didn't sit well with my parents. My mom, who's a teacher, would always tell me that education was the key to the future, that speech I was getting tired of hearing. At that moment, I could barely pay attention, But looking at where I am today, I get what she meant. Back then I was just a rebellious and immature teenager. A year later, I decided to enroll in an alternative school called Moore Mickens. This place was a haven for teenagers like me, who had been excluded or dropped out of school for various reasons. The school gave me the chance to finish high school and even offered a special program that would allow me to graduate a year early. I was originally in the class of 2011, but with this program I was moved to the class of 2010. This meant that, even though I had repeated my freshman year, I was now ahead of all my old classmates. In a way, this was a relief. So with this new opportunity, I enrolled, completed all the necessary paperwork, and soon enough I was heading to my first day of school in my second year of high school. Once I got there, it felt like I was starting from scratch. The environment was totally different, and I was surrounded by pregnant young women and other kids who had been through rehab centers. I clearly didn't fit in with that group, so during breakfast I ended up sitting alone in the cafeteria, lost in my thoughts and not interacting with anyone. That's when suddenly a guy I recognized walked in. His name was George. He was one of the few people I actually talked to about my experience at my previous high school. While we weren't close friends, he was the only familiar face in that place. I found out that, just like me, he was struggling, pretty much being excluded from the school community. I waved at him, we started talking, and in a way we reconnected. Later that day, my sister offered to pick me up from school. When classes were over, I went to the parking lot to wait for her. George also had someone picking him up, so we started talking again. I asked, "How was your day?" "It was terrible," he replied bluntly. "I get it, man," I said. He continued with a bitter tone. "People are so stupid. I wish I could just take them all out." Yeah, sure," I replied, trying to change the subject. But then, he said something that really stuck with me. "I'm serious. I'd actually bring a gun and kill everyone. I guess, hate people." I went quiet, a little unsettled, but quickly tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. "Yeah, sure. Hey, there's my sister. I'll catch you later." George gave me a blank look as I quickly walked toward the car. Looking back now, I realized that conversation should have been a warning, but at the time my mind was occupied with other things, and I brushed it off as just another rant from an angry teenager. The next day, the class schedule changed, and I ended up having the same art class as George. Coincidentally, the art teacher and I got along well because she let me draw things like skulls, zombies, and other cool topics instead of forcing me to do boring assignments. I was sitting there drawing a cute picture of Eddie, the Iron Maiden mascot, while George and two other guys were chatting among themselves. Suddenly, George stood up, walked over to the door, and ripped a map of the school off the wall. He came back with the map, started marking it with a red pen, and one of the other guys asked what he was doing. "You'll see. Everyone will see," George replied vaguely and mysteriously. At that moment, I didn't think much of it, though the conversation in the parking lot came back to my mind. To be honest, I thought he was just creating some fantasy or imagining something. It didn't seem serious. After all, the school was a place for outsiders, and George seemed to like being the center of attention, making shocking statements to stir up the group. But a few days later, what I saw made me question everything. I was heading to class just before I entered. The door to the room opened, and a police officer walked out, escorting George, followed by the principal. I froze, shocked and horrified. All I could think was, "Oh." George looked at me with a cold stare as he passed by, and I couldn't hold his gaze. George's story went beyond what I had imagined. The school, with so many young parents, took that situation very seriously. They found information on George's MySpace page suggesting a possible conspiracy for a school shooting. Here in Florida, threats like that are taken extremely seriously, even if they're just the rants of an angry teenager. The police later found over 28 firearms at George's house. While they were all registered in his grandfather's name and kept in a locked cabinet, for someone like George, access to them wouldn't have been a huge obstacle. Thankfully, he was taken away, and his plans never came to fruition. Moore Mickens was shut down a few years later. Despite everything that happened, I had many good times there. I recovered and eventually graduated with the class of 2010. I'm not sure if George would have gone through with his plans, but I'll never forget the coldness of his words that day in art class. You'll see. Everyone will see. Hey guys, it's Uncle Unit. I hope you enjoyed the stories. This last one was actually a personal experience of mine, and looking back I realize I should have taken what George said a lot more seriously. If you're in school and someone talks about doing something violent, please tell someone immediately. It's not worth taking the risk. If someone is saying this, it's a clear sign that they need help and something might be wrong in their life. This should be treated seriously. Lastly, I'm happy to finally be over a bad cold and able to record videos for you all again. For those who don't know, I got married last month on the 25th, and right after that I got sick. That messed up my plans because I had planned to record as much content as possible before heading out for the honeymoon. But even with the setbacks, I truly appreciate everyone who sent good vibes. It really means a lot to us. Thank you, you're amazing, and as always, never forget, you are awesome.